So a little bit about me then. My name's Chris Gregory. I run a company called Alternative Stories. We make podcasts and radio programs. So I'm an independent supplier to BBC Radio, but I make 4 different podcasts. I make audio content for other people. And I've been doing that for 3 or 4 years now. And so the world of podcasts. Well, first of all, any podcast listeners here? Anyone who listens to podcasts? Rachel, yeah, I can see your hand. Yeah, there's a few of you that have discovered podcasting. Now, one of the great things I think about podcasting, quite apart from the fact that they are becoming more and more popular, I think people enjoy the on-demand nature of podcasts. The fact that you can get something wherever you are, really. A lot of people listen in their car, they listen on headphones as they're going for a walk. You can listen to a podcast while you're doing other things. It's a nice way to absorb topics that you're interested in. And because podcasts are made by individuals, they can go into quite kind of esoteric and niche areas. So, it would be very difficult to turn on the radio and find something about archaeology at any given time. But I bet there are lots and lots of podcasts out there about archaeology that you can find and download and listen whenever you want to. So it's great for the independent or amateur producer to share the love of their hobby or interest with other people. Now, because they're free as well, I think that there's something very kind of egalitarian about podcasts. You don't need money to be able to listen. They're international. So when I release a podcast, I put out a podcast yesterday morning, and by lunchtime it had been heard in 19 different countries around the world. So it's a really nice way of connecting with other like-minded people around the world, and but also in your local area as well. And finally, I'd say about podcasting, it's really great for inclusivity. So if you're blind or partially sighted, then a podcast can be really useful for you in the way that a journal or something that you need to read or watch isn't so useful. So lots of really good things about podcasting, and things that I think that that your members will enjoy working on. So today what we're going to do, we're going to go kind of behind the scenes of what makes a podcast. I'm going to give you some advice on how you might think about planning a podcast, putting a script together for your podcast, and then doing some recording of it. And then at the end, we'll talk about editing, what we call post-production in the business. So that's when you've got your recordings, how do you make them into a nice sounding podcast that doesn't have long gaps of silence or, different sound levels and all of that sort of thing. So any questions at this point? Is that broadly what you were expecting from me today? Excellent. I was seeing a few nods. Just, I will pause from time to time. We'll have a break kind of midway through the session as well. I'll pause for questions at junctures through the session as well. But if you've got any questions, pop them into the chat if you can see that, and then I'll see that you've posted something, and I can either address it there and then or address it next time we pause. Great. So I'm going to start to think about some of the skills that I hope your members will learn by doing this session on podcasting. First of all, I think they're going to have to think about format. So we'll go through some different formats for podcasts shortly. And I think they can take their leads on this from listening to radio shows. What sort of formats do radio shows follow? What sort of formats, if they're podcast listeners, are there other formats that they particularly like? And to think about what format is going to work well for them in their desire to talk about archaeology, their hobby, to other people. So we're going to think also about the journalistic aspects of this, kind of planning out the podcast, writing some content. If we're going to have a presenter who has a script going through the podcast and introduces the different features, we're going to need to write and prepare that script for a presenter. One thing that I often hear about podcasts is that they often sound like they're completely off the cuff, like the person speaking is kind of making it up as they go along. Almost always, I would say that there is some script involved in that. There's very few people that can just talk off the cuff. So, and that's a skill that we're gonna need to think about. How do we write those presenter scripts? If we're going to have an interview, which we might well do, the interviewer is going to need to prepare some questions in advance. And we're going to have to think about how those questions get the best possible responses from the interviewees. So think about the areas that they are knowledgeable about, and let's focus in on those areas. Because what we're trying to do in a podcast is not be Jeremy Paxman grilling a politician. We're trying to get the best possible content out of the people that we're working with. So once we've got all of that, we will start to think about doing the recording. That'll be a good fun exercise, and it's where we start to go from a bit artistic and a bit writery to a bit technical. It's where art and science meet, really. So we're going to do some recording. We've got some tips on doing that. Then when we've got all our recordings, we'll look at how we assemble them into a finished podcast. And I've got a what's called a digital audio workstation open, so I'll be able to show you how that works. I've also prepared for you a couple of fact sheets. So there's a Google Drive with some fact sheets and a video showing you the way around a digital audio workstation with me talking over the top of it, which hopefully will be useful when you come to do this, and you can look at it at your leisure. So let's start then by talking about planning the podcast. So the first thing we're going to need to talk about is the format. Now, I think probably the best format that you might want to adopt would be a kind of magazine style format. Now, what I mean by that is if you think of radio programs, let's think about the Today program on Radio 4. What would have in the Today program would be a mixture of different content. Any Radio 4 listeners out there? Anyone ever listen to Radio 4 in the morning? Or maybe, but you could also think of TV programs that follow this format. So Newsnight, for example, would follow this format. So you have a presenter who is the face or the voice of the podcast, and they introduce different features within the podcast. So there might be a feature about a particular dig that your members have been involved in, and you might get a couple of them talking about it. We might do a kind of outside recording on a phone at the site, so it sounds like we're out and about doing things, or they may choose to be at home recording in a nice quiet setting, but just talking about what they've done on that dig. And then we might go to perhaps an interview. Perhaps a member of the group has done something notable or noteworthy, and we can do an interview with them, record that interview, and that would be another feature. We might do another feature on an upcoming piece of work that the group are going to be involved in. Perhaps telling other members the kit they're going to need, or the research they might need to do, a couple of books they might want to read, or websites they might want to visit to find out more about what it is they're going to be doing. So these are the kinds of bits of content that I think you would want to put into a magazine style podcast, and we probably want to make them long enough that they are interesting and informative, but not so long that they completely dominate a podcast. So I would say we might want to make them, between 5 and 10 minutes each feature. And so the kids are going to need to do a little bit of planning around that and get an idea of what they're going to be doing within that feature or the interview. Now, we'll talk later about how we bundle all of that together into a podcast, but that's basically the magazine format that I'm referring to. And what I'm going to do now, I'm going to just share my screen so that you can see a suggested format for an interview style or magazine style podcast. Just bear with me a moment. This I've put this template into the shared drive as well, so that you'll be able to kind of refer to that. Can you see that now? It's a
all good, Chris.
document. You can see that. Okay, excellent. So this is kind of how I think a magazine style podcast would run. So as you know, all radio shows usually open with a bit of theme music. So we'd have an opening theme. One of the things I do alongside all the podcasting, I write and compose music. So I can give you a few kind of generic bits of theme music. I'll drop those into the Google Drive as well before I share it. And you're very welcome to use any of those as a generic bit of opening music. The opening music then would fade into the voice of a presenter. And that presenter might say something along the lines of, "Hi, my name's, I don't know, Ollie, and you're listening to the YAC podcast. In this edition, we'll be looking at topic. We'll have an interview with Joe and Bob. We'll share memories of the, insert name of dig that we did here last year. But first, last year, a group in Yorkshire found something unusual in a field near wherever, and we spoke to Josh and Olivia, who are part of that group. And that's a link into our first feature. So, all of this is kind of interchangeable, but generally our first bit of presenter script would introduce what we're going to be doing in the rest of the podcast. And then we go into that first feature, maybe about 5 minutes. And then after that, we would have a presenter saying thank you to the people that presented that last one and introducing our next feature. Let's say that's going to be another 5 minutes. And can you see how we're kind of layering it up here in the style of a radio show, really? So this presenter becomes quite an important voice in our podcast, and we're layering the features with the voice of this presenter who's kind of anchoring the show and holding it all together. And then towards the end, we'd also have the theme music coming back, fading in, and running under the next section where we do the closing credits. And so in the closing credits, we'd thank everyone who was involved, probably do a link, talk about our website, thank everyone for listening, invite new members to join, all the sorts of things, all the information that you might want to do in a newsletter or something like that, I guess. And then we could get an idea then of what the total running time of our podcast is. So by doing something like this, not only have we written a script for our presenter, and in doing that, I think we've kind of cemented in our own minds what's going to be part of this podcast, but we've got a plan for the podcast as well. We know what the features are going to be. We know what order we're going to put them in. And we know broadly how long our podcast is going to be. So really what this is a kind of, this is a set of editorial and journalistic skills, really. And I think it's important that we get the kids understanding that radio shows don't just happen. They need to be planned. They need to be prepared. And there's some element of scripting in them. Are there any questions about this at this point? Stop sharing there. By all means, if you do have any questions, just drop them into the chat, and I'll be able to address them there and then. Do people recognise that as a kind of format that you might hear in a radio show? I think it'll be something that's familiar to certainly most of you, but also probably a lot of the kids that listen as well. I mean, it's kind of the format of a show like Blue Peter, if you think about it as well, where you've got the presenters and they present a series of features within the show. So that's one format. That's what we call the magazine format. Who can think of other formats that podcasts might take? I mean, if you're a listener to podcasts, a very common format would be what we call the long form interview. So we might have a particular guest or a couple of guests, and the podcast would just be an interview with those guests. So you might want to, I mean, if the kids know an eminent archaeologist or someone who's been involved in a particularly interesting project, you might want to actually spend half an hour talking to that person. And that would be a great format for a podcast. Lots of podcasts are based on that type of format. One of the great things about podcasts versus radio shows is that if the content still feels interesting, we can just keep going. We don't have to fit between news bulletins or other programs in the way that radio shows do. We can actually, go for as long as we want, really. And as long as it keeps sounding interesting, and the interviewee has still got important things to say, we can just keep that going. So that's the interview format. One thing I would always say about interviews, as I mentioned earlier, we're not Jeremy Paxman here. We're not trying to catch anyone out. We're trying to present what they say and them in the best possible light. So I would always say, for an interview format, it's important that you prepare the questions beforehand. And I think it's important that you share those questions with the person that you're going to be interviewing a couple of days before you plan the interview. And what that will allow them to do is to kind of, first of all, be aware of the questions. I think in a lot of ways, kids are quite good at catching you on the hop with, and we all know, if we're all parents, we know that some of the questions we get from our kids can be quite off the wall. But it allows them to prepare the best possible answers as well. So if they are prepared, they might, for example, think, okay, I'm going to be asked about this particular thing. So before I do the interview, I'm going to scribble down a few references so that I can quote those references. They might be website addresses or videos that you could go and watch on YouTube. But for the interviewee to be able to have that level of preparation, I think is quite good. And for the interviewer, it means that there's never a point where they're sitting there in silence thinking, what the hell's the next question going to be? There's a script that they're going to follow. And that doesn't mean that you can't go off piste slightly. Sometimes the interviewee will say things that prompt other questions. And I think it's important for the spontaneity of an interview that you can follow those little side roads, because that's often where a lot of the more interesting stuff comes from. But to have that basic structure of an interview, I think is quite important. So that's the interview podcast format. Another format that you might want to follow would be a feature or an extended feature. The Guardian does a podcast based on what they call their long reads. So in amongst all the other news reports and articles that the Guardian runs, it does sometimes run something called a long read, which is an extended bit of writing. It might be a couple of pages of their magazine or more. And they make a podcast based on that, the Long Read podcast. And usually what that will be an extended feature, half an hour or so, talking about a single topic. And in that, you might well have several voices. You might mix different bits of content. So a bit about, perhaps the person who led a particular dig, talking about what the aims of that dig were, what was found. And then we could perhaps go to another voice talking in a lot of detail about one particular find. We might do a little interview with some of the people that were involved in that dig. And we'll build up a podcast over, with all those bits of content and edit that together. But essentially, it's a feature on one particular topic. That, and I think that's also a very popular format for the podcast. We've got a question in the chat from Debbie. Do you have to get the interviewee to sign anything to say that they will let you broadcast? Yeah, I think it's always a good idea to get them to just sign something, so you've got that in writing. The other thing that I usually do when I've interviewed someone, and I've edited that interview, something that I always try to do if I can, is to be fair to them and often to me, to edit out the ums and ers. We all do that when we speak. Sometimes I'll mix up my words or stumble over some words, and I might want to edit that out as well, so that it flows nicely. Sometimes some of us have say sentences that are not particularly on topic as well, so I might want to edit that out as well, just to make the interview as concise as I can. But yeah, having a signed, what we call a release clause, actually, or a release note, is always a good idea. And letting them listen through to the podcast that you're about to release. That's not to say that you have to edit it if they request you to do so, because they've signed that initial thing. But normally you'll have a relationship with the person that you're interviewing anyway. The fact that they've agreed to be interviewed is usually a good sign that they're not going to then say, no, you can't use that. And again, we're not going to be catching them out. Hopefully we're giving them content. We're giving them a good platform for their knowledge anyway. But yeah, be courteous to your interviewees and share with them all you can. Yeah, and Joe's just pointed out that there's already an existing permissions form that you could use to do that. So I'm sure we could share that, and perhaps we could put that into the Google Drive, Joe, so that that's on hand when everyone needs it. So yeah, I think that's the three main formats of podcasts that you might want to look at. So just to recap, so the magazine format, which is a bit of several things; the interview format, a long chat with one or two people, and the kind of detailed single topic feature podcast. So yeah, they're the formats that I think we might want to look at. So any questions about format or anything else at this point? Okay. So the next stage of what we're going to do is the actual recording. And true to form again, I've prepared you a kind of fact sheet on recording. There's lots of different ways we can do this. Now, Joe may have mentioned already that there might be a small grant available to purchase some microphones. Now, these will be microphones that you can either plug into a phone and then record using software on your phone, or they could perhaps plug into a laptop directly, and then you can record from straight into your laptop, or perhaps into a tablet like an iPad. And all of these devices will have some software on them that allows you to record. So if you've got a phone, you will have a voice note recorder on there. And you just may need to just find that software and familiarize yourself with it. One of the things that I've also done some notes on is if you haven't got a microphone, and you may have a microphone but not have it with you at the point that you want to do your recording, you can use the built-in microphone on your phone to make a reasonable quality recording. And I've got some notes that I'll share in that Google Drive on how to get the best quality recording from a phone or a tablet or a laptop, without using an external microphone. Now, one of the things about the microphone and phone combination, or microphone and tablet, or microphone and laptop combination, is that there are so many different combinations. There are different models, even if you're an Apple iPhone user. Some older models will have a headphone jack socket that you could plug a microphone in. Some of them will just have the what's called the lightning power socket that you could plug a microphone into. So there are, as many different combinations as there are models of phone. So one of the things we're going to get you to do, if you're going to be the leader who will be working with the members on this project, is let us know the combination that you have. What's the phone you have? What's the model of the phone? And what's the version of the software on it? That's particularly important, I think, for Android users, because lots and lots of different manufacturers' phones use Android as their operating system. So you could have a Samsung or lots of different models of phone. So it's important that we understand that. We will then kind of advise on what will be the best microphone for you to procure. Or you may just prefer to use the notes about recording using the microphone on the phone. And I would encourage you, before you come into contact with the group on this project, to kind of experiment with doing a couple of recordings from your phone and see how the different distances from your mouth as you record, placing it on a table in front of you rather than hand holding it, putting it on a pile of books so it comes up to the level of your mouth as you record. All of those different combinations, how they affect the sound, and what you think are going to be what's the best sound quality that you can get from that phone. So all of that, I think, is really important. So a couple of thoughts on recording. There is a law of audio recording that says that no matter how lucid and precise you are in your speech, the moment that you press record on a device, you will start to slur your words and mess everything up. This is true in speech podcasting as much as it is in music and all sorts of other things. So one of the things I would say before you start a recording, this is all stuff to pass on to the kids as well. Do a little vocal warm-up. So the one I always recommend, it's not so good for vegetarians and vegans, but I always recommend pepperoni macaroni. Just do that for 20 seconds or so, maybe getting a bit faster. Pepperoni macaroni. It's the old Peter Piper picked a peck of, and I can't even do that. But that's a great thing that a lot of the actors that I work with do, these vocal warm-ups. When you've done your pepperoni and macaroni, it's staying on food. We can go to mozzarella gorgonzola, and just feel the way that your tongue loosens and your mouth starts to get a bit looser as you do that warm-up. And you'll always see, if you ever see the making of a TV show, you'll see the host, before they go on air, they'll always be kind of doing all that kind of vocal warm-up that they do before they start to speak. So that's one of the things that will help the kids to think about what it is to be a presenter, and what you need to do to present your voice in the best possible way. The other thing I would always suggest just before you start to speak is to kind of just loosen, let your shoulders drop a bit, puff your chest out, just take a few deep breaths. Breath is really important when we're speaking. And one of the things that you'll find when you're going back to that earlier stage, when you're writing your scripts, you will find that if you're a writer that writes very long sentences, your presenter will not love you, because they'll start speaking and the sentence will keep going, and there will be subclauses in the sentence, and it will keep going and it will keep going, and suddenly you find that you can't actually finish that sentence. So something that it's worth the presenter and the writer working together on is, can I actually say that sentence without taking a big gasp for breath? And so this is all stuff that you would never think about writing, say, for a journal or for an article on a website, but it's very important when you're doing podcasting. So be relaxed, do your vocal warm-up, then press record, and just keep going. So if you stumble over some words, just pause, and then after a second or so, go back to the bit before you stumbled, or back to the beginning if you want to, and just speak again. And concentrate on speaking at a nice pace. No one wants to listen to someone talking really, really fast and in a very frantic sort of way. So think about the way that TV and radio presenters speak. Keep it in control. Think about being relaxed and speaking not too slowly. We don't want to talk at the pace of a snail, but we want to be precise. We want our words to be understood. So clarity is really important. And then, don't be afraid to pause, go back, start that section again, or start the whole thing again, and just keep going. Now, that's the tips, I think, for presenter or someone who is introducing a particular section of a podcast. The same is true in a lot of ways for interviewees. So when I'm doing an interview, I will always say to the interviewee before we start, look, if you stumble over words, don't try and make the best of that. Either hold your hand up and say, can we pause? And I'll ask the question again and you can start again, or go back to the bit just before you stumbled and start again from there. There's a lot to be said actually in the world of, speech for keeping going, keeping the flow of a piece. And so, just go with the moment and do what feels best. Emma, you've got your hand up.
Hey, and on that, is it better to have one continuous recording that you can edit as a whole rather than having to clip together, doing complete breaks and restarting recording?
I think, certainly for an interview, you would probably want one complete recording. You could split it up, and in terms of the editing afterwards, so long as you label what the different recordings are, and we'll talk about that later as well. Giving good and meaningful file names, I think, is really important. So you certainly could split it up, but as I was saying, that the whole thing of the flow, I think, will probably lend itself once you're talking. Once you get into your stride of talking, you probably don't then want to be, pressing stop on your phone or recording device, saving the file, giving it a file name, and then opening a new file and pressing record on that. So I think whatever feels good for you, but I think generally we would say that one file will work well. The one thing that is really useful actually is the pause, because when we look, and I'll show you this later actually, when we look at the file in an audio workstation, you see these little audio wave files. You will be able to see where the pauses are. So another thing that we sometimes get people to do, I work with a lot of actors, so if they're doing lines for a drama and they stumble over their lines, one thing we sometimes get them to do is either with a pen that clicks close to the microphone, or even going like that with their mouth. That creates a really spiky little wave that we can then see in the waveform afterwards, and we know that's the point where we want to edit. So little tricks like that, but but silence. Always give it a couple of seconds between takes, and you'll see that on the WAV file. I'll show you that shortly, so you know what I'm talking about when we start to talk about the post-production and editing. Does that answer the question, Emma? Yeah, excellent. So yeah, and I think so. So the checklist would be: warm up, be relaxed. The person doing the recording, often it can be useful, and certainly you're going to be working with a group and you're going to give them all jobs. I think it would be useful to have someone starting the recording, with the phone, with the microphone, pressing record, and then maybe quietly going to say, right, we're rolling now, and then have the presenter speak, rather than the presenter having to do all of that themselves. So, and I think when you're working in your group, I think it will become fairly obvious soon which of the kids want to be in front of the microphone and which want to be the other side of the microphone. Introverts versus extroverts. I think you'll find. And some of them will love the technical side of it. Let's face it, kids are so tech savvy these days. They'll probably know about all the software on phones and things already. And some of them will love to play with all of that stuff. And some of them will want to be, the ones that maybe do a bit of drama as well. They'll want to be in front of the microphone doing the talking. And so we've got roles for everyone, I think. So, let's recap what the roles are. We need writers to do our scripts. We need editors to go over the writing and make sure that that's going to work well in our format. We need the technical people who are going to be doing the recording and the post-production, which we'll talk about after the break. And we're going to need the extroverts who are actually on microphone, doing the presenting, and the experts as well, the people that have been on the digs, know a lot about, I don't know, Roman coins or whatever, who can actually be our experts on microphone and talk us through these things. So there's our little team, and I'm sure a lot of you are thinking in your own heads, well, which of my members are going to be in those categories. So that's probably the casting the roles as your first job in the first meeting when you're talking about this. I think this would be a really good time for a break. So just before we break, are there any further questions at this point? Joe's just saying, yeah, I think this is a great way to get everyone involved in one way or another, and that's the great thing. Okay, right. Well, I'm going to talk next about something we need to do once we've done our recordings. I'll re-stress again. Really, really important thing that you must do, particularly if you've got multiple files on your phone or whatever device you've used to record. Give them meaningful file names so that you can find them easily later. Because by default, a lot of them give the name of the location where you are. Which isn't going to be particularly meaningful. So give it a name, give it a timestamp if you can. Usually the later the timestamp, the better the recording will be, because the fact that you've done multiple recordings showed that you weren't happy with the first ones. So what I might do is give it a name like Roman coin feature, take 1, Saturday, 1st of April, 11:54, something of that order. Just realised it's April Fool's Day, everyone. I'm not going to play any tricks or jokes on you. So yeah, give it a meaningful name so that when you come back to edit it, you will know what that is, what that recording is, and what version it is, basically. Now, what I would then suggest is that you're going to do your editing on a computer, on a laptop, usually. So set yourself up a folder on your laptop drop the recordings into there. I've done some notes. I won't go. There's a lot of different ways of getting recordings from your phone or whatever device onto your laptop. I'm sure you've probably all done that in some form or another, but I have put some notes into the fact sheet about how you can do that. You can use, I mean, if you're an Apple user, you can use AirDrop. You could use WhatsApp as a tool to send them. You could attach them to emails and email them to yourself. Lots of different ways of doing it. But I think the important thing, once you have got them all, just aggregate them all into one place, put them all into a folder, label the folder, folks, so you know what that is. And then you'll have them all in one place. And the next stage, I think, then will be to do a quick listen back. Make sure, I'd always advise doing a listen back the first bit of recording you do, because that will show you what quality you're likely to get. When you get a quality that you're happy with, don't move that phone. If you've got it on a pile of books and it's close to your mouth and that sounded really good when you listen back, don't think, oh, okay, I'll handhold it next time, or I'll put it on this shelf. Leave it where you got a good recording, and move speakers to it rather than move it to them. Would be a good tip. And you might create a little duvet fort or whatever, as I was just discussing with Jacqueline, around, so that you've got a nice clean recording surroundings. So do that listen back. Make sure you've got everything you need, because once you go away from where the presenter is or where your interviewee is, you won't be able to recreate that. So do a quick listen back, make sure the recording quality is what you would expect, and that you're happy with that, and then you can call the recording session to a close. And we're then into what's called post-production. Now, the first stage of post-production is to listen back to everything you've got and make some notes on the bits you want to keep and the bits you want to lose. And this is all part of the editing process. So this is really a journalistic skill. So have your editor, maybe I always think it's good to have a couple of people listen through and see if they agree on this. Make some notes on as the recording plays out, on the software that you play it on, and that could be something called QuickTime or Windows Media Player. It will always show you a timestamp, so you can start to make notes that 2 minutes 20 presenter coughed, and they didn't resume talking again until 2 minutes 38. So I know immediately that I'm going to edit out between 2 minutes 20 and 2 minutes 38 where the coughing happened. I might also be listening out for repetition. So the interviewee said the same thing 2 different times, between 4 minutes 30 and 5 minutes 38. I only want one of them, and I think the way they said it the second time was better. So I'm going to make my edit at 4 minutes 30, and I'm going to edit up to 5 minutes and 5 seconds. And as we work, we're going to have a sheet of paper that's got all these ideas for where we're going to edit. That's going to be really useful when we come to do the actual edit within our software. We will have a script that tells us the first things we want to listen to, the first things we want to look at and edit out. Again, this is something that will always happen in post-production for a TV show or a radio show. You'll always be working to get the pithiest, the most concise, the most clear version of whatever it is you've recorded. Other things you might want to listen out for are the ums and ers. As you can hear from me, we all do it. What we're looking for, I think, is whether a lot of them. in one particular clump, we might want to edit those out. There is something actually quite natural about saying, we don't want too many of them, but if we don't have any at all, it doesn't sound natural. It doesn't sound like the sort of conversation that we would have. And one of the things I think about podcasting is it's a more relaxed format than a radio show. It's more conversational. It's more like having a chat with a friend than it is, doing the Paxman grilling a politician thing. So, we want it to sound relaxed. We want it to sound a little bit more friendly than a radio show might sound, but we don't want too much extraneous stuff. So make notes where you think we could edit things out, and put that into your little scribbled sheet that you can come back to and refer to later. True to form, I don't know whether anyone can hear that. There's drilling coming from next door. What did I tell you? The moment you switch on a microphone, next door will get a drill out and start drilling. I haven't prepared that in advance. I haven't briefed the neighbours to do that, just to show you what happens. Apparently you can't hear anything, Joe. That's good. The microphone's obviously not as sensitive as I thought. Right. So any questions then about that first stage of post-production, that editing stage? A lot of this is going to be on gut feel, actually. What you and your editors feel they want in the podcast and what they don't. And every editor will make different decisions and different choices. There are no right and wrong answers here. But I think one thing I would always say is, when you've listened through, you will have an idea of what the strongest section of that interview is. And the interview may have gone for half an hour, but we're only going to use 10 minutes of it. So think about, what are the bits that we absolutely have to put into our interview, and make sure that you've got those. So you might say, the bit where we first describe the site and how we realized there was something interesting under this field would be the really, really useful content to probably kick things off with. And that starts at 3 minutes 12 and goes through to 4 minutes 30. So I'm definitely going to take that section, and we'll build from there. Try and make it chronological. And sometimes people don't, conversations don't go in a chronological way. So I might have something at 28 minutes into my interview that actually I think would have been really useful right at the start, so that I can explain to listeners something. So I might take that section and cut and paste it right to the start, so that it sets the scene for us. I always think it's nice in an interview to start by introducing your guest and have them say hello, or thanks for having me, or whatever. And at the end, it's nice to say thank you to Bob Jones for being the guest on our interview today, and have them say thank you. It's just a nice way of, starting and ending an interview. So do think about how you're going to do that, and take those sections if you can. Anyone ever done any interviewing? Or we probably interview people for jobs and things like that, but anyone done any interviewing on a YouTube video or anything like that? Debbie, I know you have.
Yeah, I did one for last year for a bloke called John Henry, and I had to prepare a lot in advance for my own confidence. But once I was in it, it was fine, because I'd prepared and he was quite good. And he did have I didn't give him all the questions in advance, but we have something called an In Conversation series. And so we have some setups, and like, what's your favourite archaeological song, sort of thing. So we they know that in advance. Other things are, there's a few that they don't know, but they're more conversational. But it did need some work, and I was nervous, and you could tell I was nervous. So I think practicing a few times would be quite good.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. If it's something that you aren't particularly familiar with, it's always worth having a practice. But I think, as Debbie's kind of suggested there, having an idea of what the questions are going to be, how it's going to flow, and knowing that the interviewee also has that, I think will keep you both on track, and you'll never be at a point where you're thinking, God, what's the next question? What can I ask from here? There'll always be something that you can fall back on. And another tip, I think, would be probably have a few more questions than you think you're going to need. Just so that you can fall back on something. The nightmare scenario when you're interviewing is that the interviewee, they answer their questions with yes or uh-huh. And suddenly you're going to have to then do all the work of thinking about what the next question is. So have a few up your sleeve that you can fall back on if you need to. I say you, obviously, these are tips for the kids doing this as well. Brilliant. Well, the next thing I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about how you're going to edit the software. Sorry, the podcast. And I'm going to suggest that you use free software for this. So if you if your laptop or computer is an Apple Mac, you will have or be able to get for free a product called GarageBand. Now, what that is a digital audio workstation, a DAW for short. And as the name suggests, all of these things are really for recording and editing music. But just as in a music, a song that we record, we would have a different track within the digital audio workstation for the bass or the guitar or the keyboards or the vocals. We can use the same track structure to have speaker 1, speaker 2, our theme music, our presenter, and we can just layer up a podcast like that. I'll show you this shortly. The other bit of software that I would recommend, which is a free download, actually works on Mac or Windows computers or Microsoft family, is a thing called Audacity. They all work in broadly similar ways, and they all allow you to both record and edit sound. And they generally will have multiple tracks that you can work with. And you're going to need these multiple tracks for building up and layering your podcast. Now, in the by now fabled Google Drive, I have made a video of some of the basic functions in GarageBand, which is the Apple Mac one, with my dulcet tones over the top of it, kind of explaining what I'm doing. But what I'm going to do now, I'm going to share my screen and show you GarageBand. You're able to see that?
Good.
Yeah, excellent. I'm going to make that a little bit bigger so I can see it. Right, so ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to GarageBand, a digital audio workstation. Now, can you see track 1 here? My microphone is hooked up to track 1, so you can actually see as I'm talking. You can see my my voice registering into that. So you can see that this is a working piece of software. Now, what I've done here is to put a couple of pieces of audio that I've recorded elsewhere into the workstation. So you can see there I've got a track called Untitled, and I've got a track here that I made a podcast yesterday about a new novel that's coming out called Spring Fever. So we've got these are titles for that podcast. So each of these tracks, all I've done, I've taken a folder on my computer with, remember I said we'll put all of the audio files into one folder. And I can literally just drag the audio files into this bit of software, and it will create a track for them. You'll see all of this in the video that I've prepared. I can also, so if I were to click here and say new audio track, there we go. I've created a new track, and I could drag my software into there. So this is, and I'll take you through a few basic functions within this. So can you see where my mouse is here? This button here is a play button. So I've got the sound turned down because you really need to hear me talking here. But just like, you know, on a tape player or a CD player, that play button is the little arrow, and here I'll be able to listen back to what's in that file, that one there. If I want to go back to the start of the recording, I can do that. Just use that button. And if while I'm playing I want to stop, I can use that square button. If I've got a microphone hooked up to my digital audio workstation, I can select a track like that and hit this button, the big red button. You can all guess what that does. So that's my record button. And you can now see, I'm way too close to the microphone, that is now recording my voice. I'm going to stop that because no one wants to hear that. But so I've created there a voice file. And as you can see, remember I was talking about the wiggly wave patterns. So that's what we're going to get. There's one I prepared earlier. Now, one thing I think will be useful for you in GarageBand, all of these things work in all of the different digital audio workstations, including Audacity. One thing that will be very useful is that there are different modes for this main information screen here. So this is clearly set up for music because you can see the tempo, 120 beats per minute. It's in 4/4 time in the key of C major, which I'm sure you're all delighted to know. For podcasting and for spoken word stuff, we don't need to know any of that. So I tend to set that to time. So do you remember I was saying that when we're doing our editing, we might want to know the timestamp of the bit where I burp or fart or hiccup or whatever, so that I can edit it out? Well, this is going to tell me where that is, right down to a very precise level. So there we go, 14 seconds, sorry. I know that I burped at that point, so I can easily find that to edit it out. Within GarageBand, I have a nice little slider here, which allows me to zoom in or zoom out. So here I can see my whole project. Usually when I'm editing, I want to be able to zoom right in and see a particular section of audio. So I can use this little slider to zoom in and zoom out. Down below here, at the bottom of my screen, this is my little editing window. And if I've got can you see this little scissors icon towards the top left? That's my editing window. And that's where I can do particular snips of the audio to get rid of that burp, fart, cough, whatever it was. And I've got a little zoom slider here as well, look. So I can zoom right in on that audio. And can you see this section here? I can just select that, just as I can select a sentence in Word, for example, exactly the same principle. So I'm using my mouse here, I'm clicking and dragging. And can you see there? I've selected that little bit of audio, and I can just all I did there was to hit the delete button on my keyboard, and I've got rid of that bit of audio, which wasn't actually me burping or farting, but let's imagine it was. So, and now I can, because we don't want long silences, I can bring that next bit of audio. So let's imagine that was the bit where our interviewee went off on a tangent and started talking about, their goldfish or something rather than what we wanted them to be talking about. I can easily edit that out. You'll also see there's a little bit of silence in the preamble there, so I can edit right up to that first where the waveform begins. And as you can see, I'm going to be able to see where these things are as well as listen to them. So I've got visual clues as well as audible clues when I'm doing this. The other thing that's going to be really important when I'm working with sound, you can see here that each of these 3 audio files are at different volumes. So this one that I recorded, that you saw me record, where I was way too close to the microphone, you can see because of the height of the wave patterns, that's really loud. That's way too loud. This slider here within my file allows me to adjust the volume. So I can take that volume down. This one at the top, as you can see, the wave files aren't very pronounced at all. It's going to be much quieter. So I can take the volume of that one up. And this one in the middle is, just like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, probably just about right. And so that I'd probably leave that as it was, as a marker. And then I can pitch the volume of the others to that. Let me also show you as the audio plays. I also have the overall volume slider of my project, which is here. So let me show you what happens when I play some audio. So first of all, you can see it within the individual track, and you can see it here in the overall project. Suddenly we get into the loud bit. Can you see that's going into the yellow and red zones? That's too loud. So even though I've dropped the volume a bit, I might want to take the volume down a little bit more. And ideally, I would be seeing green and maybe a little bit of yellow. Now we're into the quiet bit, and we're not seeing any yellow there at all. So I'm just going to up the volume of that one slightly. So we can play around within the project and use our ears, but also this little gauge here to see what sort of volume we're looking at for any given bit of our audio. We can also use cool little tools like cut and paste. I showed you editing a little bit of audio, but let's imagine that we wanted to take a little bit from this file and just select that bit, and I've got an edit, just as I would in Word. I can say cut, and then select where I want it to go. It will start at that point. So anytime I click along this bar, it will move my position marker to that point. Select the track that I want that to go to, and then say paste, and there it is. And then I can move that around just by clicking on it and dragging it, and start to build up my podcast that way. Looking for where the audio files are, realizing that I don't want silence within a piece, and just building it up that way. Is that kind of making sense? As I say, you've got a crib sheet for this, and you've got a video with all of these things that I'm telling you now. One really important thing is that we have a thing called an end marker. It's not very clear here, but can you see, just as I'm moving my cursor there, there's a little kind of left-facing triangle arrow sort of thing, and my cursor changes when I get over it. If I then click, I can drag that, let's say, to around about 3 minutes-ish, and that will be where my recording ends. So normally we'd do that at the end of a file, but I just wanted to show you. So everything to the right of that is grayed out, and we're not going to hear that when we for our final podcast. So if I can show you here, move that marker to there, press play, and you'll see that getting towards the end. And when it hits that line, that point where it goes grey, it will stop, because we don't want to hear that. People here next door's drilling now. I do apologise for that. There we go, and we've stopped at that point. Now, the final and really important bit here. Let's say we've done all of the editing, we've put everything in order, we've adjusted the volume, and we've kind of put our end marker in place. Next thing we need to do is to be able to turn this thing into a finished podcast, what's called an MP3 file. And so all I'm going to do is go up to share, export song to disk. We know it's not a song, it's a podcast, and then it will give me the option of where I want to put that. I want to give it a name, give it a meaningful name. Let's call it YAC Podcast, and preferably spell it correctly. And it gives it a .mp3 name automatically, and export that. And it goes through, looks at all the files, compresses them all together, stops at that grey line, converts it to an MP3, and then I'll find wherever I've asked it to put it, there'll be a file there called YAC Podcast. Now, I would strongly suggest that you get the kids to do most of this. They may well be familiar with this already. A lot of kids have experimented with making music in GarageBand, but they'll be able to pick this up. My daughter made sort of soundtracks to videos and things like that using GarageBand and Audacity when she was much younger. So I think they'll be able to work this out, and I think they'll enjoy using it as well. It's quite, it's actually quite intuitive once you kind of get your head around the concept of it. But as I said, there's a fact sheet and there is a video explaining all of this that you've seen. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point. A couple more messages. So Caroline, yeah, does Audacity work in the same way? Yes, broadly it does. I mean, they're all slightly different, but the concept of tracks, the concept of it running left to right, the buttons for recording, the fact that you'll get a time stamp at the top, all of that is would be there. Yes. What I've done also in the fact sheet, I've given you a link to a sheet on the basics of using Audacity. So you've got all of that. And I've also given you a link to a YouTube video on the basics of Audacity. So if that's the one you're going to be using, then all of that's there for you. Can you undo a deletion? That's the $1 million question. No, once you've deleted something, it's gone. So one thing that I sometimes do, I'll create a track, and rather than delete, I'll cut and paste into that track. I'll then put the volume on that track completely down. So I'm not going to hear it, but if I need to, I can go back and find those bits that I've deleted. But generally, you know, if it's a burp, a fart, a cough, or a hiccup, I'm never going to want to do that, go back to that, unless I'm putting together an amusing thing for Christmas or something, where we just have 2 minutes of burps, farts, and hiccups. But I'm way too mature to ever do that, possibly. So yeah, so I be careful about that. Have your if you feel that you're not sure, let's say it was a section of someone talking about something quite important that you felt you got a better version somewhere else, you may well want to make sure you can save that somewhere. Do also remember, though, you have still got your original files that you can work with. So if, as sometimes I do, I make a complete mess of editing something, I've got my original file to go back to. It's still in that folder with its meaningful name. Okay, we've got a few minutes for questions. Let's see, there's some in there. How long do you think this whole process would take? Thanks, Alex, for the question. From planning right through to editing and finalizing. Just wondering if it would need to be spread across multiple YAC sessions. I think so, Alex. Yeah, I think you could run this as a project across, 2 or 3 sessions, maybe, with certainly your planning first, then maybe your recording, and then your post-production afterwards. So I would say that might be a good way to run it. It might all get a bit frantic. I don't know how long your sessions are, maybe a couple of hours, perhaps. But I would think you'd certainly want to do your planning first in one session. Get people going away and thinking about all of that, because sometimes you know how it is that all your best ideas come to you in the moment that the session ends and you're driving away. So give yourself the chance to think about it in the cold light of day, come back to it, and the same for your members as well. So I would say make it an ongoing project, or you might want to run it across more sessions and have it as part of the session rather than the whole session. Use your skill and judgment as leaders as to how you're going to play that. So Debbie saying you've done some YouTube editing, and before I went ahead was very nervous, but when it came to it, it was really straightforward and not as hard as I thought it was. There we go. It's a bit like anything, really. I mean, you can always there'll always be someone on YouTube who's posted a video about how to do this, how to do something in particular. The other thing as well, everyone, I mean, we've met this morning, we all know each other. I've put my email address into the fact sheet. So if you've got any questions, drop me a note, and I'll try and help you as well